A homeless Navy SEAL bought a forgotten clock shop for $10. Then his dog uncovered a secret tied to his own bloodline. Homeless at 59, a Navy SEAL bought a $10 clockmaker's shop. His dog found what was hidden. Snow drifted across the mountains of Montana as Jack Mercer and his aging military K9 Shadow searched for one more place to survive the winter. The abandoned clock shop looked worthless to everyone else. But the moment Shadow stepped inside, he locked onto a silent grandfather clock and refused to leave. What the dog sensed would uncover a decades-old promise, a hidden inheritance, and a truth that would change Jack's life forever. Comment 1 if you believe loyalty can change a life, or 0 if you think fate plays the bigger role. And tell us where you're watching from. Snow drifted across the highway in long white ribbons, chasing the wind through the mountains of western Montana. The old pickup truck moved slowly beneath a sky the color of worn steel. Its faded blue paint was hidden beneath road salt and months of hard travel. The heater rattled more than it worked. Every few minutes it coughed out a weak breath of lukewarm air before falling silent again. Behind the wheel sat Jack Mercer. At 59 years old, he looked older than his age. The years had left deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His dark hair had surrendered almost completely to gray. His shoulders were still broad, his posture still straight, but there was a heaviness in him now that no amount of military discipline could hide. Jack had once led Navy SEAL teams through deserts, mountains, and cities half a world away. Now he spent his nights sleeping in parking lots. The contrast still surprised him sometimes. Beside him sat the only companion who had remained. Shadow. The retired military K9 rested calmly in the passenger seat. The German shepherd's muzzle had begun turning silver with age, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. He watched the snowy landscape pass beyond the window with quiet focus. The dog never complained, never questioned, never left. Jack reached over and scratched behind Shadow's ear. "You and me, buddy." Shadow's tail thumped once against the seat. That was enough. It always was. The highway curved around a frozen river. Beyond it, nestled between pine-covered slopes and snow-covered ranchland, sat the small mountain town of Silver Creek. The town looked like something from another century. Brick storefronts lined Main Street. Old wooden signs creaked gently in the wind. A church steeple rose above the rooftops. Smoke drifted from chimneys into the gray afternoon sky. Jack had no destination. Silver Creek was simply the next town. One more place to spend a night before moving on. That had become his life. One town, one parking lot, one cold night after another. He pulled into a gas station and shut off the engine. Silence immediately filled the cab. For a moment, neither man nor dog moved. Jack stared through the windshield. A flash of movement appeared in the reflection. Dust, smoke, a doorway exploding inward, the scream of a radio, gunfire. The memory arrived so suddenly his chest tightened. His breathing changed. Not again. Not here. The sounds weren't real. He knew that. But Pete didn't care what was real. The images came anyway. A teammate yelling his name. Blood on concrete. The sharp smell of burning insulation. Jack closed his eyes. Count, breathe, count again. When he opened them, Shadow was already watching him. The dog's ears tilted forward. Concern, recognition, partnership. Shadow had learned long ago how to read the signs. The dog placed a paw gently on Jack's leg, grounding him. Pulling him back, the memory faded. The gas station returned. Snow. Cold Montana now, not then. Jack released a slow breath. Thanks, partner. Shadow licked his hand once. Mission accomplished. The diner across the street glowed warmly through fogged windows. Jack grabbed the last $20 bill from his wallet. Dinner may be breakfast if he stretched it. After that, he wasn't sure. The bell above the diner door jingled as he entered. Heat wrapped around him immediately. The smell of coffee, soup, and frying bacon filled the air. Several locals glanced up before returning to their meals. Small towns were always like that. Everyone noticed strangers. Maggie Turner noticed him too. The owner stood behind the counter, pouring coffee. She looked to be in her 60s, sturdy and practical, with silver hair tied back and eyes that missed very little. She looked at Jack, then at Shadow, then back at Jack. Long drive? Jack nodded. Long year. That earned the smallest smile. Sit wherever you'd like. Jack settled into a booth near the window. Shadow lay beside him. Within minutes, Maggie appeared carrying coffee. I didn't order that. You look like you need it. Jack looked down into the steaming mug. Thank you. Maggie simply nodded and walked away. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, life carried on. Conversations, laughter, the clatter of silverware, normal things. Things Jack sometimes felt existed in a world he no longer belonged to. At the next booth, two older men were discussing town business. Jack wasn't listening until one sentence caught his attention. Still trying to get rid of that old clockmaker's shop. The second man laughed. That place should have fallen down 20 years ago. No buyers. Can't imagine why. It's practically free. Jack sipped his coffee. The first man continued. Town council voted again last week. $10 and they'll hand over the deed. The second man nearly choked, laughing. $10? Yep. Still too expensive. They laughed together. Jack looked toward the window. Across the street, halfway down Main, a narrow brick building stood squeezed between a hardware store and an empty insurance office. The faded sign above the door was barely readable beneath decades of weather. Finch Clocks. The front windows were dusty. One was boarded over. The place looked forgotten, abandoned, ignored. Something about it felt familiar. Not the building itself, the feeling. A place left behind. The next morning, Jack walked into the town clerk's office. The woman behind the desk adjusted her glasses. You want to buy the Finch building? Maybe. Most people don't. Jack shrugged. Most people aren't sleeping in a truck. The clerk stared at him for a moment, then laughed softly. Fair point. 30 minutes later, after signing paperwork nobody expected anyone to sign, Jack handed over a $10 bill. The clerk slid a brass key across the counter. Congratulations. Jack stared at it. That's it? That's it. He picked up the key. For the first time in months, maybe years, he owned something. Not much, but something. Outside, Shadow waited patiently beside the truck. Jack held up the key. Looks like we bought a clock shop. Shadow wagged his tail. The old dog seemed surprisingly pleased. Together they crossed Main Street. The wind pushed snow across the sidewalks. The brass key turned stiffly inside the lock. The door groaned open. Dust floated through pale shafts of winter sunlight. The shop smelled of old wood, machine oil, time itself. Rows of clocks filled the room. Wall clocks, mantel clocks, grandfather clocks, every one of them silent. Everyone frozen at a different moment. Jack stepped inside slowly. His boots creaked against the floorboards. Shadow entered beside him. For several seconds the dog stood still. Then something changed. His ears snapped upright. His body stiffened. Without hesitation he began walking. Past the counters, past the shelves, past dozens of silent clocks. Straight toward the rear wall, Jack followed. At the far end of the room stood a massive grandfather clock. Nearly 8 feet tall, dark walnut, glass-fronted. Beautiful despite decades of neglect. Its pendulum hung motionless, its hands frozen forever at 11:17. Shadow stopped directly in front of it. The dog sat and stared. Jack frowned. What is it? No response. Shadow never took his eyes off the clock. Minutes passed. The dog remained motionless. Jack finally walked away to inspect the rest of the building. When he returned, Shadow was still there, watching, waiting, listening. The afternoon faded. Light disappeared from the windows. The temperature dropped. Jack eventually unrolled his sleeping bag near the front counter. The shop wasn't much, but it was warmer than the truck. Safer, too. He looked toward the back of the room. Shadow hadn't moved. The old dog still sat before the grandfather clock. Then a sound broke the silence. A soft whine, low, uneasy. Shadow stood, pressed his nose against the wooden base, whined again, then looked back at Jack. The expression in the dog's eyes was unmistakable. Not fear, not curiosity, certainty. As if he knew something was there. Something important, something hidden. Jack slowly rose to his feet. The grandfather clock towered silently in the darkness. Shadow stepped closer to it, then closer still, and refused to leave. Jack stood in the dim light of the abandoned shop, staring at Shadow. The German shepherd pressed his nose against the wooden base of the grandfather clock and released another low whine. The sound echoed softly through the silent room. Dozens of clocks surrounded them, hundreds perhaps, all frozen, all waiting. Yet Shadow cared about only one. Jack walked toward him, his boots creaked across the old floorboards. The dog did not move. "What's got your attention, partner?" Shadow briefly glanced at him, then returned his focus to the clock. The old seal studied the massive timepiece. Its walnut case was dark with age. Dust coated the glass. The brass pendulum hung motionless inside. The clock looked beautiful and forgotten at the same time. Nothing seemed unusual. No scent, no sound, no movement, just silence. But Shadow had spent years detecting explosives, weapons, hidden compartments, and threats that human eyes missed. Jack had learned long ago not to dismiss the dog's instincts. Still, exhaustion weighed heavily on him. He rubbed his face. "We'll figure it out tomorrow." Shadow remained exactly where he was. The dog clearly disagreed. Jack smiled despite himself. "That's an order." Shadow looked unimpressed. For a brief moment, the old soldier felt something he had not experienced in months. Amusement. A small thing, but real. Eventually, the dog allowed himself to be led toward the front of the shop. Jack spread out his sleeping bag near the counter. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. The wind moaned around the corners of the old building. Shadow curled up nearby. But even as he settled down, the dog kept glancing toward the grandfather clock, watching it, waiting, as though expecting something. Jack lay back and stared at the ceiling. The pressed tin panels reflected faint moonlight. The shop smelled of dust and aged wood. It reminded him strangely of old churches he had seen during deployments overseas. Buildings abandoned by people but not by memories. His eyes slowly closed. Sleep came quickly. The nightmare came faster. The explosion arrived first. It always did. The deafening blast, the flash, the wave of heat. Then the screams. Jack found himself back in a distant city thousands of miles away. Gunfire echoed through narrow streets. Smoke swallowed the sky. Someone was shouting. Someone was hurt. His team was moving, running, fighting. The radio crackled. Then silence. Terrible silence. The kind that meant something had gone wrong. Very wrong. Jack spun around in the dream, looking, searching, unable to find the men who had trusted him, unable to stop what was already happening. The familiar helplessness crushed down on him. Then another sound cut through the nightmare. A bark. Sharp, urgent, real. Jack's eyes snapped open. His heart pounded violently. For a second, he didn't know where he was. Desert, war, Montana, past, present, everything blurred together. Then Shadow appeared beside him. The dog stood with his front paws on Jack's chest, alert, concerned, grounding him, bringing him back. The nightmare faded. The clock shop returned. Moonlight, dust, cold air, silence. Jack sat up slowly. His breathing gradually steadied. Shadow remained beside him. The dog had done this countless times. During deployments, after deployments, in motel rooms, parking lots, truck stops, wherever life had taken them. Shadow always knew. Always appeared before the panic fully took hold. Jack placed both hands on the dog's shoulders. "Good boy." The shepherd leaned against him, solid, reliable, present, the way only a loyal dog could be. The rest of the night passed quietly. Morning arrived beneath pale winter sunlight. Silver Creek looked almost beautiful beneath fresh snow. The mountains surrounding town glowed pink and gold beneath the sunrise. Jack stepped outside carrying a battered metal coffee cup. His breath drifted into the cold air. Across Main Street, people were already beginning their day. A delivery truck unloaded supplies. A snowplow pushed through the intersection. The town was waking up. Jack looked back at the shop. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't wondering where he would sleep tonight. The realization surprised him. The building wasn't much, but it was something, more than he had yesterday. Inside, Shadow had already returned to the grandfather clock. Of course he had. Jack laughed softly. You really don't give up. The dog's tail thumped once. The morning passed with cleaning. Jack opened windows, swept floors, removed decades of dust. The work felt good, simple, honest. Every broom stroke revealed a little more of the shop's history. Under the dirt, the floorboards showed beautiful craftsmanship. The counters were made from hand-polished oak. Old brass fixtures gleamed beneath years of neglect. Someone had once cared deeply about this place. That much was obvious. Near noon, the front door opened. An elderly woman entered, carrying a stack of books. She wore a thick wool coat and wire-rimmed glasses. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back. Jack immediately recognized her. The librarian, Evelyn Hart. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." She looked around the shop, then smiled. "Looks better already," Jack shrugged. "Still has a long way to go. So do most worthwhile things." Her eyes settled briefly on Shadow. The dog watched her carefully, then relaxed. That seemed to satisfy her. Evelyn held out the books. "I thought these might help." Jack accepted them. The titles surprised him. Montana History, Restoring Historic Buildings, The Bitterroot Valley, A Century of Stories. Why? Evelyn smiled. Because nobody buys an abandoned clock shop unless they're planning to stay a while. Jack didn't answer. Truthfully, he didn't know if he was staying. But he didn't know if he was leaving either. For now, that felt like progress. Before departing, Evelyn paused beside the grandfather clock. Her expression changed slightly, almost nostalgic. "That old thing still standing? You know it? Everyone in town knows it." She gently touched the glass. Walter Finch was very proud of this clock. Jack looked up. "The owner?" She nodded. "The last clockmaker in Silver Creek. What happened to him?" Evelyn grew thoughtful. "No one really knows." That answer lingered after she left. No one really knows. The words echoed in Jack's mind. The mystery intrigued him, more than he wanted to admit. By evening, exhaustion settled into his muscles. But it was a different kind of exhaustion. Not the hopeless fatigue of drifting. Not the emptiness of survival. This was earned, productive. The shop already felt less abandoned, less forgotten. As darkness gathered outside, Jack heated canned soup on a portable camping stove. Shadow sat nearby, watching, waiting. When dinner ended, the dog immediately walked back toward the grandfather clock. Again, Jack followed. The shepherd lowered himself onto the floor beside it. The same position, the same focus, the same strange certainty. Jack crouched beside him. For several moments, they both stared at the clock. Nothing happened. No hidden sounds. No mysterious movement. Only silence. Then Jack noticed something. A tiny detail, barely visible beneath years of dust. Scratches, fresh scratches, near the wooden base, not decades old, recent, made by Shadow over the past 2 days. The dog had been scratching the exact same spot, again and again. Jack slowly reached out and ran his fingers across the wood. The grain felt smooth, solid, ordinary. Yet Shadow immediately became alert. His ears rose. His body stiffened. The dog pressed his nose against the spot, then looked directly at Jack. The same look, the same certainty. Jack felt a small chill travel through him. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe. But years in the teams had taught him one simple lesson. When a trusted partner keeps pointing at the same place, you pay attention. Outside, snow began falling once more. Inside the old clock shop, the grandfather clock stood silent in the darkness. Shadow refused to leave its side, and for the first time, Jack found himself wondering if the dog might be trying to tell him something after all. Something hidden, something waiting, something buried inside the silence. The thought stayed with Jack long after he climbed into his sleeping bag that night. The old clock shop had become quieter than any place he had slept in for years. No highway noise, no truck engines, no late-night voices drifting across parking lots. Only the wind outside and the occasional creak of aging timber settling against the Montana cold. Yet somehow the silence felt crowded. Every clock in the building seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. The sensation followed him into sleep. Morning arrived beneath a curtain of fresh snow. Silver Creek looked as though it had been carved from ice. The rooftops wore white caps. The sidewalks disappeared beneath drifts. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys throughout town. Jack woke before sunrise. Years in the military had made sleeping late almost impossible. Shadow was already awake. The shepherd sat beside the grandfather clock. Of course he did. Jack shook his head. You know, most dogs chase squirrels. Shadow blinked, apparently unimpressed. The old soldier laughed quietly and began another day of cleaning. By noon, the shop had transformed again. More sunlight reached the floor. Dust-covered shelves began revealing their contents. Dozens of clocks emerged from beneath decades of neglect. Some were small enough to fit in one hand. Others stood taller than a man, each one frozen, each one silent. Each one stopped at a different moment in time. Jack found himself examining them more closely. The first stood frozen at 2:14, the next at 8:51, another at 11:03. An ornate wall clock displayed 4:22. A brass carriage clock rested permanently at 7:40. None matched, no pattern, no explanation. Just hundreds of interrupted moments. It was strangely unsettling, as if every clock carried the memory of the instant it had died. While cleaning a shelf near the back wall, Jack discovered an old ledger book. The leather cover cracked when he opened it. Dust drifted into the air. Inside, elegant handwriting filled the pages. Dates, names, repairs, observations. The first entry was dated 1948. The final entry ended abruptly in 1964. Walter Finch. The name appeared repeatedly. Jack lowered himself onto a stool and began reading. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, a long-dead man slowly came back to life. Walter Finch had not simply repaired clocks. He had known the people who owned them. Every entry contained stories. Mrs. Keegan's anniversary clock, a rancher's pocket watch carried through the Korean War, a wedding gift passed from father to daughter, a mantel clock that survived a house fire. Walter wrote about each item as if it were a person, not property, family. The entries fascinated Jack. He kept reading. Hours passed unnoticed. At some point, Shadow wandered over and rested beside the stool. Together, they listened to the silence while Jack explored another man's life. One entry caught his attention. June 17, 1959. A clock is not a machine. A clock is memory made visible. People think I repair gears and springs. What I truly repair is continuity. I help yesterday reach tomorrow. Jack stared at the words. Simple, honest, strangely powerful. He turned another page. March 3, 1961. The younger generation prefers electric clocks. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps my trade belongs to another century. But there is value in things that require care. The things we must tend often become the things we love. Jack slowly closed the journal. For a moment he simply sat there, thinking. He understood that feeling. The military had been like that. Discipline, maintenance, responsibility. The constant effort required to keep something functioning. A team, a mission, a life. The things that demanded care often became the things that mattered most. The realization lingered. The front door opened suddenly. A burst of cold air swept through the shop. Jack looked up. Maggie Turner stepped inside, carrying 2 paper bags. Figured you'd forget lunch. Jack smiled. You're making assumptions. You've been reading the same book for 4 hours. Fair point. She handed him a sandwich and coffee. Shadow immediately received a treat. The shepherd accepted it with professional dignity. Maggie glanced around the shop. Looks different every time I come in. It's getting there. She nodded toward the grandfather clock. That one's still giving your dog trouble? Jack looked over. Shadow had already returned to his post. Watching, waiting. The same as always. Yeah, funny. What? My grandfather used to say that Walter Finch trusted dogs more than people. Jack raised an eyebrow. Really? Oh yes, she laughed softly. Said dogs never lied about what they sensed. The comment stayed with Jack after she left. Dogs never lied about what they sensed. Late that afternoon, he began exploring the second floor. A narrow staircase led above the shop. Dust coated every step. The upper level consisted of 2 small rooms. One had clearly served as Walter Finch's living quarters. The other looked like storage. An iron bed frame stood beside a window overlooking Main Street. A small desk occupied one corner. A bookshelf lined an entire wall. Most of the books dealt with clockmaking. Some dated back to the 19th century. Others contained handwritten notes tucked between the pages. Jack examined everything carefully. Years of military training had taught him to observe details, patterns, anomalies, anything out of place. Nothing immediately stood out until he opened the desk drawer. Inside sat a photograph, black and white, edges worn with age. The image showed Walter Finch standing beside a storefront, the clock shop, brand new, fresh paint, clean windows. The year 1952 was written on the back. Jack studied Walter's face. The clockmaker looked ordinary. Average height, thin, wire-rimmed glasses, nothing remarkable. Yet something in his expression felt familiar, purpose. The same sense of mission Jack had seen in good soldiers. Men who knew exactly why they woke up every morning. Jack slipped the photograph back into the drawer. The sun had already begun setting. Outside, shadows stretched across the snow-covered town. Inside, the shop slowly darkened. He descended the stairs. The moment he reached the main floor, shadow appeared. The dog immediately walked toward the grandfather clock. Again. Every single day, every single hour, the same destination, Jack followed. The old clock stood motionless against the wall, silent, patient. Its brass pendulum reflected the fading sunlight. Jack crouched beside the base. His fingers brushed the wood, then stopped. Something caught his attention. Not the scratches Shadow had made. Something else. Metal. Tiny points of reflected light. Jack leaned closer. Dust covered most of the clock, but 6 brass screws near the rear panel gleamed faintly beneath the grime. Cleaner, brighter, newer. His eyes narrowed. The rest of the clock appeared decades old. These screws did not. At least not compared to everything around them. Jack ran his thumb across one. The metal felt smooth, almost untouched. A strange feeling settled into his stomach. Not fear, curiosity. The kind that had kept him alive during military operations. Something didn't fit. Something was wrong. Or perhaps something was hidden. Shadow suddenly stood, his ears lifted. The dog pressed his nose against the exact section of wood behind the screws, then looked directly at Jack. The message was unmistakable. There. Jack stared at the panel, then at the dog, then back at the panel. Outside, darkness swallowed Silver Creek. Inside the abandoned shop, surrounded by hundreds of silent clocks, Jack Mercer felt the first true pulse of mystery. Walter Finch had left something behind, and Shadow seemed determined to make sure it would eventually be found. For the next 3 days, that certainty settled over the old clock shop like a second layer of dust. Jack could not stop thinking about the brass screws. They didn't belong. Everything else in the grandfather clock showed its age. The wood carried tiny cracks. The finish had faded. The brass pendulum was tarnished from decades of neglect. Yet those 6 screws looked newer. Not new exactly, just newer. As if someone had removed the panel long after the clock had been built. Several times Jack considered taking the clock apart. Several times he stopped himself. Years in the military had taught him patience. If there was a secret hidden inside the clock, it had remained there for decades. It wasn't going anywhere. Meanwhile, life in Silver Creek slowly continued around him. Each morning he swept floors. Each afternoon he cleaned shelves and sorted tools. Each evening he sat near the old wood stove he had repaired and read Walter Finch's journals. The clockmaker's words became strangely comforting. One entry stopped him for nearly an hour. October 14, 1956. A man does not belong to the years he has already lived. He belongs to whatever purpose still waits for him tomorrow. Jack read the sentence 3 times, then a 4th. Outside, snow fell softly against the windows. Inside, the words lingered. Purpose. The word followed him everywhere. It haunted him almost as much as the memories. Because purpose had vanished from his life the day he left the teams. For nearly 3 decades, every morning had begun with a mission. Every action mattered. Every decision served a goal. Then suddenly there was nothing. No team, no objective, no direction, just silence. The same silence that filled this shop. Shadow rested beside his chair. The dog lifted his head and watched him. "You ever wonder why we're here?" Jack asked. Shadow's ears twitched. The old soldier smiled. "Yeah, me too." The dog lowered his head again. The conversation was over as far as he was concerned. A few days later, Evelyn Hart arrived carrying another stack of books. She paused when she entered. The transformation inside the shop was impossible to miss. Sunlight now reached the back wall. The floors shined. The counters looked almost respectable. "You've done more in 2 weeks than the town managed in 20 years. Jack accepted the compliment with an awkward shrug. Evelyn walked slowly through the room. Her fingers brushed one of the silent wall clocks. "Walter would have liked this. You knew him well?" The librarian smiled sadly. "As well as anyone." Jack looked up from the workbench. "What happened to him?" The smile faded. "That's a question people still ask." She moved toward the front window. Outside, children crossed the street on their way home from school. For a moment she watched them, then she spoke. Walter Finch was one of those people who belonged completely to his work. Meaning? He never married, never had children, never left Silver Creek. Her eyes drifted across the street. The clocks were his family. Jack understood that better than he wanted to admit. Evelyn continued. "Then one day he closed the shop. Just like that? Just like that. What happened afterward? No one knows." Jack frowned. "Nobody? He sold almost nothing, left most of his tools behind, locked the door, then disappeared." The mystery deepened, and somehow that made Walter Finch feel more real, not less. A man whose story ended mid-sentence, like one of the silent clocks surrounding them. That evening a storm rolled down from the mountains. The sky darkened before sunset. Heavy clouds swallowed the peaks. Wind rattled signs along Main Street. Snow arrived shortly afterward. The blizzard struck with surprising force. By nightfall, visibility had vanished. The shop groaned beneath the assault. Jack secured the windows and fed more wood into the stove. The flames cast dancing shadows across the walls. Rows of silent clocks seemed to watch from the darkness. Shadow remained beside the grandfather clock. Always the grandfather clock. Jack sat reading another journal when the first boom exploded outside. His body reacted instantly. The book dropped from his hands. Adrenaline surged through him. A flash of white lit the windows. Another boom followed, then another. His heart slammed against his ribs. For one terrifying moment, Silver Creek disappeared. The clock shop disappeared. The storm disappeared. His mind dragged him somewhere else. Somewhere hot. Somewhere loud, a battlefield. The explosion echoed again. Not outside, inside his head. His breathing quickened. His vision narrowed. The room tilted. Jack rose suddenly from his chair. The old panic was returning, the dangerous kind. The kind that convinced him to run. The kind that had cost him jobs, friendships, his marriage. Another flash lit the windows. Fireworks. A delayed winter festival celebration somewhere in town. Nothing dangerous, nothing real, but PTSD didn't care. The memories were already awake. Jack grabbed his coat. He needed air, needed distance, needed to leave. The urge became overwhelming. Without thinking, he headed for the door. Halfway there, something blocked his path. Shadow, the German shepherd, stood directly in front of the exit, rigid, alert, immovable. "Move, buddy." Shadow didn't move. Jack reached for the handle. The dog stepped sideways, blocking it again. "Come on." Another explosion sounded outside. Jack flinched. The room seemed smaller, the walls closer, the panic stronger. He tried again. Shadow refused. For the first time in years, the dog growled, not aggressively, firmly, a warning. The message was clear. "Stay." Jack stared at him. The old shepherd stared back. Neither moved. Seconds stretched into minutes. The storm howled beyond the windows. Fireworks continued somewhere in the distance. Then something remarkable happened. Jack's breathing slowly began to settle. The panic loosened. The flashbacks weakened. Reality returned. The clock shop emerged from the fog inside his mind. The stove, the journals, the wooden floors, shadow, always shadow. The old soldier sank into a chair, exhausted, ashamed, relieved. The shepherd immediately walked over and rested his head on Jack's knee. No judgment. No questions, just loyalty. Jack buried one hand in the dog's fur. You knew. Shadow's tail moved once. You knew I was about to walk away. Another slow tail wag. Jack looked around the shop. For the first time, he realized how close he had come. Not just tonight, over the past few years. Leaving, running, giving up. The dog had stopped him again. As he sat there, recovering from the episode, Shadow suddenly lifted his head. His ears rose. His attention shifted toward the grandfather clock. Immediately, instantly, the dog stood, walked across the room and resumed his post. Guarding, watching, waiting. Jack followed slowly. The grandfather clock stood silent in the flickering firelight. Its glass reflected orange flames. Its pendulum remained motionless. The 6 brass screws gleamed faintly near the rear panel. Shadow pressed his nose against the wood, then looked back at Jack. The same expression, the same certainty, the same silent insistence. Jack felt a chill unrelated to the storm. For weeks he had assumed the dog was merely curious. Now he wasn't so sure. Shadow had saved his life too many times, found too many dangers, detected too many hidden threats. A dog like Shadow didn't obsess over nothing. The storm continued outside. The grandfather clock stood silent, and for the first time, Jack became convinced that his partner wasn't guarding the clock. He was protecting a secret. The realization stayed with him long after the storm passed. By morning, Silver Creek had disappeared beneath nearly a foot of fresh snow. Sunlight spilled across the mountains, turning the frozen landscape gold. The storm had left the town quiet, almost reverent. Jack stood outside the shop with a shovel in his hands, clearing a path from the sidewalk to the front door. His breath drifted in white clouds. Shadow sat nearby, watching the street. For the first time in years, Jack noticed something unusual. He was looking forward to the day. The feeling caught him off guard. For months, maybe years, every morning had felt identical. Wake up, survive, keep moving. Repeat. Now there was something waiting for him inside. Not just shelter, purpose. The word from Walter Finch's journal returned again. Purpose. When the path was cleared, Jack stepped inside and shut the door against the cold. The warmth from the wood stove lingered in the shop. Sunlight streamed through the front windows. Dust no longer dominated the room. The building felt alive, not fully alive, but awakening. Shadow made his usual trip toward the grandfather clock. Jack smiled. Go check your secret. The dog's tail moved once. Then he resumed his post. Jack settled into a chair beside the workbench and opened another journal. The leather binding cracked softly. Walter Finch's handwriting filled every page, neat, patient, deliberate. The handwriting of a man who understood time. Jack began reading. January 9th, 1954. A clockmaker's greatest tool is not a screwdriver. It is patience. The parts eventually reveal their problems if you listen long enough. People are much the same. Jack paused. The words felt less like instructions and more like wisdom. He continued reading. Some entries discussed repairs. Others described customers. Many reflected on life itself. The deeper Jack read, the more Walter Finch became real. Not simply a dead craftsman. A person, a man with doubts, dreams, regrets, hope. One entry caught his attention immediately. April 18, 1957. Young people think purpose arrives like lightning. They are wrong. Purpose arrives quietly. It waits in the work we return to each morning. Jack stared at the sentence. His eyes drifted toward Shadow. The old dog remained beside the grandfather clock, waiting, steady, faithful. For years, Jack had searched for a dramatic answer to his unhappiness. A new job, a new city, a new beginning. Perhaps Walter Finch was right. Perhaps purpose didn't arrive dramatically. Perhaps it arrived one day at a time, one task at a time, one repaired thing at a time. The bell above the door jingled. Jack looked up. An older rancher stepped inside carrying a wooden wall clock. The man removed his hat. You the fellow who bought this place? Jack nodded. Depends who's asking. The rancher chuckled. Name's Ben Holloway. He carefully set the clock on the counter. My wife heard somebody finally opened Finch's shop. Jack examined the clock. Dust covered the case. The pendulum hung crooked inside. I don't actually know anything about clocks. Ben shrugged. Neither do I. Then why bring it here? The rancher's expression softened. It belonged to my father. Jack understood immediately. The clock wasn't a machine. It was memory. Walter Finch had been right about that too. I can take a look, Ben smiled. That's all I'm asking. After the rancher left, Jack carried the clock to the workbench. The rear panel opened easily. The mechanism inside was surprisingly simple. Years of military training had taught him how to work carefully with mechanical systems. He studied each part. Nothing appeared broken, just dirty, neglected, forgotten, like the shop itself. Using notes from Walter's journals, he carefully cleaned the gears, adjusted the pendulum, removed decades of grime. 3 hours later, he gently restarted the mechanism. The pendulum swung. Tick, tick, tick. The sound filled the room. Jack froze. A strange emotion swept through him. Satisfaction. Not because the repair was difficult, because something silent was speaking again. Shadow immediately lifted his head. His ears twitched. The dog listened, then returned to his watch beside the grandfather clock. Apparently, one clock was not enough. That evening, Ben returned. Jack handed over the restored wall clock. The rancher listened to the steady ticking. For several moments, he said nothing. His eyes grew suspiciously bright. My father used to sit beside this thing every evening. Jack nodded. He understood. Ben reached into his pocket. I don't have much. You don't owe me anything. The rancher ignored him. He placed several bills on the counter. Then another 20. That's too much. No, Ben smiled. It isn't. As the rancher left, Jack noticed something unfamiliar. Pride. Not military pride. Not the pride of achievement. The quieter kind. The kind that came from helping someone. The kind he hadn't felt in a very long time. Over the next week, more people arrived. A retired teacher with a mantel clock. A widow carrying a pocket watch. A farmer with a broken regulator clock. Word traveled quickly through Silver Creek. The old clock shop was open again, and somehow that mattered. Each visitor brought stories, memories, pieces of family history. Jack found himself listening, really listening. For years he had avoided people, avoided conversations, avoided connection. Now he looked forward to hearing their stories. The change was subtle, but real. One snowy evening, Evelyn Hart arrived carrying a small cardboard box. I found these in the library archives. Jack opened the box. Inside were photographs, newspaper clippings, letters, everything connected to Walter Finch. For hours, they sat together sorting through the collection. The photographs showed Walter throughout the decades. Young, middle-aged, older, always in the shop, always surrounded by clocks. One photograph showed him standing beside the massive grandfather clock, the same one Shadow guarded every day. Jack studied the image carefully, then noticed something. A notebook rested beneath Walter's hand, different from the journals upstairs, smaller, more personal. Have you seen this notebook? Evelyn shook her head. No. Jack turned over the photograph. Written on the back was a date. November 1963, less than a year before Walter disappeared. Later that night, after Evelyn left, Jack searched the upstairs apartment. Desk drawers, bookshelves, closets, boxes. Eventually, he discovered a narrow compartment hidden behind a shelf. Inside sat a single notebook. The cover matched the photograph exactly. Jack's pulse quickened. Slowly, he opened it. The first pages contained ordinary notes. Repairs, measurements, appointments. Then, halfway through the notebook, everything changed. The entries became deeply personal, and one sentence immediately caught his attention. October 3, 1963. I have finally located the family of the sailor. Jack frowned. The sailor? He turned the page. The next entry was even stranger. November 11, 1963. A promise made during war should survive peace, even if it takes another generation. Jack sat perfectly still. Outside, snow drifted through the darkness. Inside, the mystery deepened. The final entry on the page ended with a sentence that sent a chill down his spine. The promise will remain hidden until the right soldier finds it. Jack slowly lowered the notebook. Across the room, Shadow stood beside the grandfather clock, watching, waiting, as if he had known all along. Jack sat motionless in the upstairs apartment, the small notebook resting in his hands. The words seemed to echo through the room. The right soldier. Not a soldier, the right soldier. Outside the window, snow drifted through the darkness of Silver Creek. Inside, something far older than the storm was beginning to move. Jack read the entry again, then a third time. The handwriting was unmistakably Walter Finch's. The clockmaker had hidden something. Not simply a possession, not merely money, a promise connected to a sailor, a promise intended for another generation. And somehow Shadow had led him directly to it. The old soldier slowly closed the notebook. Across the room, the floor creaked beneath his boots as he stood. Downstairs, he could hear the faint sound of Shadow moving. The dog was awake, waiting. Jack descended the staircase. The shop below sat in shadows and moonlight. Rows of silent clocks surrounded him. Every frozen face seemed to watch. Every unmoving pendulum seemed to listen. At the far end of the room stood the grandfather clock, and beside it sat Shadow, exactly where he always sat. The German shepherd lifted his head the moment Jack approached. The dog stood, walked to the clock, pressed his nose against the lower panel, then looked back. There. The message was impossible to misunderstand. Now, Jack exhaled slowly. "All right, partner." Shadow's ears lifted. "Let's see what you've been trying to tell me." The next dawned gray and cold. Jack spent most of the day trying to focus on ordinary work. He repaired 2 clocks, swept the floors, read another journal. But his thoughts kept returning to the grandfather clock. By afternoon, he finally gave up pretending. The mystery had become too large, the questions too numerous. He carried a toolbox toward the rear wall. Shadow immediately stood, alert, focused, ready. Jack crouched beside the clock. For several moments he simply studied it. The wood, the glass, the brass pendulum, the 6 screws. Years of military experience had taught him that details mattered. And those screws mattered, because they didn't belong. He selected a screwdriver, carefully inserted it into the first slot, turned. The screw loosened immediately, not rusted, not seized, as though someone had intended it to be removed. One by one, he backed them out. The metal clicked softly against the workbench beside him. Shadow never looked away. When the 6th screw came free, silence settled over the room. Jack placed both hands against the rear panel. Pulled gently. Nothing. He frowned. Pulled harder. A soft crack echoed through the clock case. The panel shifted. Dust drifted into the air. Slowly, carefully, the hidden section swung outward. Jack froze. Behind the panel sat a narrow compartment. A space no ordinary customer would ever discover. A space deliberately concealed. His pulse quickened. Shadow stepped closer. The dog stared into the opening. Inside rested a small steel box, no larger than a shoebox, gray, weathered, untouched. Jack removed it carefully. The metal felt cold, heavy, very heavy. For a moment he simply stared. The hidden compartment was real. Walter Finch had truly left something behind. The old soldier carried the box to the workbench. Shadow followed closely. The steel latch resisted at first, then finally snapped open. Jack lifted the lid, his breath caught. Inside lay 3 items: a brass key, a bundle of folded documents, and an old photograph. Nothing else, no gold, no cash, no obvious treasure. Yet something about the photograph immediately commanded his attention. He picked it up. The black and white image had faded with age. The corners were worn, the surface cracked. 2 men stood together beside what appeared to be a military truck. One wore civilian clothes. Walter Finch, younger, thinner, without the glasses seen in later photographs. The second man wore a Navy uniform, young, confident, strong. Jack stared. Something felt familiar, not the face itself, the resemblance. His chest tightened. His hands began trembling. "No," the word escaped as little more than a whisper. Shadow moved closer. The photograph shook in Jack's fingers. The sailor's face stared back across 80 years. A face Jack had seen before. In family albums, in old framed photographs, in faded memories from childhood. His grandfather, Thomas Mercer, Jack's grandfather. The man who had died when Jack was only 7 years old. The man who never once mentioned Montana. Never mentioned Walter Finch. Never mentioned Silver Creek. Never mentioned any promise. Jack sat heavily in the chair. The room seemed to tilt. Every piece of the mystery suddenly became larger, far larger. This was no random discovery, no coincidence. His grandfather and Walter Finch had known each other. Somehow, somewhere, the realization struck like a thunderclap. Shadow rested his head against Jack's leg. The old soldier looked down at him. You knew there was something here. The dog blinked, calm, certain, as if none of this surprised him at all. Jack laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because he didn't know what else to do. He looked back at the photograph. His grandfather appeared no older than 25. The image captured a moment frozen in time. Two men standing side by side, one a sailor, one a future clockmaker, connected by something history had buried. Jack carefully unfolded the documents. Most appeared to be letters, receipts, notes. One envelope stood apart from the rest. Its paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in Walter Finch's unmistakable handwriting, were 8 simple words. For the Mercer family if they are found. Jack stared. His pulse hammered inside his chest. The envelope had been waiting here for decades. Waiting through snowstorms, through changing generations, through wars, through the rise and fall of entire lives. Waiting for him. Outside, evening shadows stretched across Silver Creek. Inside the old clock shop surrounded by silent clocks and forgotten years, Jack Mercer slowly turned the envelope over in his hands. The answers he had been searching for were finally within reach, and for the first time since buying the abandoned shop, he realized the mystery was far bigger than hidden compartments, far bigger than Walter Finch, far bigger than the grandfather clock. Somehow, impossibly, it had always been about his own family, and the secret they never knew they carried. The envelope rested in Jack's hands. Outside, evening settled over Silver Creek. Snow reflected the fading light, turning the streets pale blue beneath the gathering darkness. Inside the clock shop, silence surrounded him. Hundreds of clocks stood frozen around the room. Shadow remained beside the workbench, watching, waiting. As though he understood the importance of the moment, Jack carefully slid one finger beneath the flap. The paper crackled softly. The envelope had waited decades for this. Longer than many lives. Longer than some buildings survived. Longer than Walter Finch could ever have imagined. Inside was a single folded letter. Its pages had yellowed with age. The ink remained surprisingly clear. Jack unfolded it carefully. At the top was a date. March 14, 1964. Beneath it, a name, to the Mercer family. Jack swallowed hard. Then he began reading. If you are reading this letter, then time has finally accomplished what I could not. My name is Walter Finch. Many people in Silver Creek know me as a clockmaker. But before I became a clockmaker, I was a frightened young sailor who owed his life to another man. His name was Thomas Mercer. Jack's chest tightened. His grandfather. The old soldier continued reading. In 1944, during a convoy crossing the Atlantic, our ship came under attack during a violent storm. I was 22 years old. I was certain I was going to die. The sea believed the same. Jack stared at the page. Walter's words felt immediate, alive, as if the man were sitting across the table, telling the story himself. During the attack, I was thrown overboard. The water was black. The storm was worse. I remember believing I had already drowned. Then someone jumped after me. Not because he was ordered to. Not because anyone expected him to. He jumped because another human being needed help. That man was Thomas Mercer. Jack felt something twist inside his chest. His grandfather had rarely spoken about the war. When he did, he always changed the subject quickly. No stories, no medals, no heroics, nothing. Walter's letter continued. He pulled me back to the ship. He nearly lost his own life doing it. For the remainder of the war, I considered every day I lived to be a gift I had not earned. When the war ended, we exchanged letters for several years. Then life happened. Families happened. Distance happened. Eventually, we lost contact. I spent decades trying to locate him again. When I finally succeeded, I learned he had already passed away. Jack lowered the letter briefly. His eyes drifted toward the photograph. The young sailor smiled from another era, a version of his grandfather he had never known. A man whose actions had changed another life forever. Shadow quietly rested his head against Jack's leg. The familiar weight grounded him. Jack scratched behind the dog's ear before returning to the letter. For many years I struggled with a question. How does a person repay a debt that can never truly be repaid? Money seemed inadequate. Words seemed insufficient. Gratitude alone felt incomplete. So I chose another path. I decided to preserve something for the future. Something that might eventually find its way back to the Mercer family, if fate was willing. Jack's pulse quickened. The mystery was finally taking shape. Walter had hidden more than memories, more than a photograph, more than a story. The letter continued. The world changes quickly. People disappear. Families scatter. Promises fade. But clocks taught me something important. Time only moves forward because something inside continues turning. The same is true for people. What we do today echoes far beyond our own lives. Thomas Mercer saved me. Everything I built afterward exists because of that choice. The shop, the clocks, the years, all of it. A tear slid down Jack's cheek. He didn't wipe it away, he simply listened. The wind outside, the silence inside. Walter's voice reaching across 60 years. You may wonder why I concealed these items. The answer is simple. I wanted them found by the right person. Not by a collector, not by a banker, not by someone interested only in money. I wanted them found by someone who understood service, someone who understood sacrifice, someone willing to protect rather than possess, someone like Thomas Mercer, or someone descended from him. Jack stared at the words. His vision blurred slightly. For years, he had carried the belief that his best days were behind him, that everything meaningful in his life had already happened, that he had become a burden drifting from town to town. Now a dead man was telling him otherwise. A dead man who had never met him. Walter believed that character traveled through generations, that duty mattered, that service mattered. The idea struck deeper than Jack expected. He continued reading. If you are a Mercer, know this. Your family gave me more years than I deserved. Because of Thomas Mercer, I built a life. Because of Thomas Mercer, I learned my trade. Because of Thomas Mercer, hundreds of families still hear clocks ticking in their homes. One act of courage created countless others. Never underestimate what a single decision can become. Jack closed his eyes. For a moment he pictured his grandfather. Not the elderly man from childhood memories. The young sailor, the man standing beside Walter Finch in the photograph. Strong, fearless, ordinary, yet capable of extraordinary kindness. The realization humbled him. The letter contained one final section. When my time comes, I will leave behind one last gift. The key within this box opens the next chapter of the story. But before you follow that path, remember this. Inheritance is not ownership. Inheritance is responsibility. If you choose to continue, choose carefully. Some treasures demand stewardship, not possession. Jack slowly lowered the final page. The room seemed impossibly quiet. Even Shadow remained perfectly still. Neither moved for several moments. Outside, night settled completely over Silver Creek. The town lights glowed softly through the falling snow. Inside the shop, the old grandfather clock stood silent. No ticking, no movement, only waiting. The same waiting Walter Finch had described. Jack folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. Then he picked up the brass key. Its surface reflected the lamplight, heavy, old, purposeful. Whatever came next was connected to this key, connected to Walter Finch, connected to Thomas Mercer, connected somehow to him. For the first time in years, Jack felt something stronger than sadness. Stronger than regret, stronger even than curiosity. Hope, a dangerous thing, a powerful thing. The possibility that his story was not ending. The possibility that it was beginning again. Shadow rose to his feet. The dog stretched slowly, then looked toward the grandfather clock. Not at the hidden compartment, not at the steel box, at the clock itself. As though reminding Jack that the mystery wasn't over. Not even close. The old soldier followed the dog's gaze. The clock remained silent. But now he understood something Walter Finch had known all along. Sometimes the most important thing in a room isn't what is speaking. It's what is waiting to be heard. The words stayed with Jack through the night. Long after the lamps were extinguished. Long after the snow stopped falling. Long after Silver Creek disappeared beneath darkness. He slept lightly, the brass key resting on the table beside his bedroll. Several times he woke and looked at it. Each time the same thought returned. Walter Finch had hidden that key for a reason. Not to be admired. Not to be collected, to be used. Morning arrived clear and bright. Sunlight poured through the shop windows and painted long golden rectangles across the floor. The mountains surrounding Silver Creek gleamed beneath fresh snow. For the first time in weeks, the sky was completely blue. Shadow was already awake. The old shepherd sat beside the grandfather clock, watching, always watching. Jack brewed coffee on the stove and unfolded the final pages tucked beneath Walter's letter. Most were sketches, maps, notes, measurements. At first they appeared confusing. Then patterns began emerging. A drawing of Silver Creek, a railroad line, an old station building, several symbols, a circle around a location beyond the western edge of town. Beside it, Walter had written 3 words. Begin beneath the tracks. Jack studied the page carefully. Another note appeared lower down. The key opens the first lock. The journals reveal the second. Trust the path. Trust the dog. Jack leaned back in his chair. A slow smile appeared. Trust the dog. Shadow lifted his head. His ears twitched. Apparently, Walter was a fan. The shepherd looked pleased with himself. By midday, Jack had packed a backpack, flashlight, notebook, water, the brass key, several copies of Walter's notes. Outside, the town moved through its ordinary routines. Children crossed snowy sidewalks. Ranch trucks rolled along Main Street. The diner windows glowed warmly. Jack stopped briefly at the library. Evelyn Hart looked up from behind her desk as he entered. Judging by that expression, you found something. Jack hesitated, then placed Walter's photograph on the counter. Evelyn stared, her eyes widened. Good heavens, you recognize him? The clockmaker, yes, she pointed at the younger sailor. But not him, my grandfather. Evelyn looked genuinely surprised. Jack told her everything. The hidden compartment, the letter, the promise, the key. By the time he finished, the librarian sat speechless. Finally, she shook her head slowly. All these years. What? Everyone assumed Walter disappeared, carrying his secrets with him. She smiled faintly. Turns out he left them behind. Jack unfolded the map. Evelyn studied it carefully. Recognition flickered across her face. I know this location. You do? She pointed toward the western edge of town. Old railroad station. The abandoned one? She nodded. Closed sometime in the early 70s. Jack felt his pulse quicken. Another piece of the puzzle sliding into place. An hour later, he and Shadow followed a snow-covered road out of town. The abandoned station sat alone against a backdrop of mountains and pine forest. Time had not been kind to it. Broken windows stared outward like empty eyes. The platform sagged beneath decades of weather. Snow drifted across rusted rails. The entire place felt forgotten. Exactly the kind of location Walter Finch would choose. Shadow immediately became alert. The shepherd moved ahead with surprising energy. His nose worked constantly, back and forth, searching, tracking. Jack followed. The old station door resisted before finally opening with a groan. Dust filled the air. Sunlight pierced broken windows in bright shafts. Inside, silence ruled. Benches, ticket counters, old schedules hanging crookedly on walls, frozen remnants of another era. Jack unfolded Walter's map again. One symbol matched the station precisely. Another pointed toward the basement. A staircase descended beneath the building. Shadow reached it first. Without hesitation, he started down. The old soldier followed. The temperature dropped noticeably underground. The basement smelled of stone and rust. Rows of storage rooms lined the corridor. Most stood empty. One heavy steel door remained locked. Shadow stopped directly in front of it, then sat. The same behavior, the same certainty. Jack almost laughed. You're 2 for 2. The brass key felt cold in his hand. He inserted it into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came a solid metallic click. The door opened inward. Darkness waited beyond. Jack switched on his flashlight. The beam swept across concrete walls, old filing cabinets, wooden crates, shelving, and a large steel vault door set into the far wall. His breath caught. The room had clearly been used as secure storage decades earlier. Walter Finch hadn't hidden a secret inside the station. He had hidden a secret beneath it. Shadow moved forward carefully. His nails clicked against the concrete. Jack approached the vault. Unlike the first door, this one stood unlocked. A simple handle protruded from the center. Attached was a note. The paper had yellowed with age. Walter's handwriting covered a single line. Some promises take longer than others. Jack turned the handle. The vault door swung open. The flashlight beam entered first. Then Jack followed. Rows of shelves filled the chamber. Not gold, not jewels, not stacks of cash, documents, boxes, ledgers, maps, folders. Hundreds of carefully organized records. Jack stood silently. The discovery felt larger than treasure. More important somehow. A lifetime of work preserved underground. On the nearest shelf sat a wooden case. Inside were deed records, property maps, railroad easements, mineral surveys, land ownership documents stretching back generations. Jack opened another folder, then another. The numbers quickly became impossible to ignore. Acres, rights, claims, properties. Walter Finch had quietly accumulated valuable holdings over decades. Not through greed, through patience. The estimated value made Jack's head spin. Millions, perhaps many millions. Yet beneath the top document rested another letter. He unfolded it immediately. If you have reached this room, then you already understand the first lesson. The inheritance is not the reward. The inheritance is the responsibility, Jack continued reading. These lands must remain protected. The clock shop must remain standing. The history of this valley must not disappear beneath careless hands. If you accept what is here, you become its steward, not its owner, its steward. Jack lowered the page. The words echoed through the vault. Steward. The same idea appeared again and again throughout Walter's writings. Responsibility, service, guardianship. The inheritance wasn't freedom, it was duty. Shadow sat quietly beside him. The old shepherd's eyes reflected the flashlight beam. For a moment, Jack looked around the hidden room, then back at his dog, then at Walter's letter. A homeless veteran had walked into Silver Creek with nothing but an aging truck and a loyal dog. Now he stood inside a forgotten vault, holding the future of an entire legacy. And somehow the most surprising part wasn't the wealth. It was the realization that Walter Finch had trusted him to protect it. Outside, beyond layers of stone and steel, the mountains stood silent beneath winter sunlight. Inside the hidden vault, Jack Mercer understood that the mystery was entering a new phase. The secret had been found. Now came the question Walter Finch had been asking all along. What kind of man would choose to carry it forward? Jack stood alone inside the underground vault for a long time. The flashlight beam rested on rows of documents that represented more wealth than he had ever imagined. Land deeds, mineral rights, railroad easements, property agreements. Entire sections of the valley seemed connected to Walter Finch's careful planning. Yet none of it felt like treasure. Not in the way people usually imagined treasure. Treasure was supposed to feel exciting. This felt heavy, like responsibility, like duty, like another mission. Shadow sat beside him in the quiet chamber. The old shepherd watched patiently as Jack closed the final folder and returned it to the shelf. Looks like Walter left us homework. Shadow's tail thumped softly against the concrete floor. The sound echoed through the vault. For the first time, Jack smiled. Then he locked the room exactly as he had found it. The documents remained underground, safe, undisturbed, at least for now. Outside, the afternoon sun hung low above the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the snow-covered landscape. Jack and Shadow drove back toward Silver Creek in thoughtful silence. The truck's tires crunched over frozen roads. Beyond the windshield, the valley seemed different now. Not because the land had changed, because Jack knew something about it that almost nobody else did. Walter Finch's legacy was hidden beneath it, and somehow that legacy now belonged to him, or perhaps belonged to his care. The distinction mattered. That evening, he visited Evelyn Hart. The librarian listened quietly as Jack described the vault, the documents, the land, the conditions in Walter's letter. By the time he finished, Evelyn sat speechless. The fire crackled softly in her small living room. Outside, snow drifted against the windows. Finally, she spoke. Walter always believed history should be protected. Jack nodded. He spent his entire life doing it. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. You know what surprises me most? What? He trusted someone he would never meet. Jack stared into the fire. The observation struck deeper than he expected. Walter Finch had spent decades preparing for a future he would never see, trusting that eventually the right person would arrive. Not because of luck, because of character. The thought lingered long after Jack returned to the shop. The following week passed quietly. Life settled into a rhythm. People continued bringing clocks for repair. Jack continued restoring them. The shop slowly became part of the town again. Each repaired clock added another small voice to the silence. Ticking, measuring, living. The townspeople noticed. More importantly, they appreciated it. One afternoon, Maggie Turner arrived carrying a pie. You've become popular, Jack laughed. I repaired 3 clocks. You'd think you cured a disease, Maggie smiled. In a town this size, fixing memories matters. Shadow accepted a piece of turkey from her pocket. The dog clearly approved of Maggie's visits. As she prepared to leave, her expression shifted. Something troubled her. What is it? Jack asked. She hesitated, then looked toward Main Street. A black SUV has driven past here 4 times today, Jack frowned. Maybe they're lost. Maybe, but her tone suggested otherwise. That evening, Jack noticed it himself. A dark luxury SUV rolled slowly past the clock shop. The vehicle continued down the street, then returned 20 minutes later. Its tinted windows concealed the occupants. The truck passed again the next morning, and again the day after that. By the end of the week, even Shadow had noticed. The shepherd stood near the window whenever the vehicle appeared, watching, alert, the old instincts returning. Jack's instincts returned as well. Something wasn't right. The answer arrived 3 days later. The black SUV parked directly outside the shop. A tall man stepped out, expensive coat, polished boots, confident smile, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. He entered the shop and looked around slowly, evaluating, calculating, measuring. Jack had met men like him before. Men who saw value before they saw people. The stranger extended his hand. Jack Mercer. Jack shook it. Who's asking? Clayton Rhodes. The name meant nothing to Jack. Apparently, the reaction amused the visitor. I'm surprised. Should I know you? I own Rhodes Development. Still nothing. Clayton laughed softly. Most people around here know me. Shadow moved closer. Not aggressive, just attentive. Watching. Clayton noticed. Beautiful dog. Jack nodded. He's smarter than most people. The developer's smile tightened slightly. Then he began walking around the shop, examining everything. The clocks, the counters, the walls, the grandfather clock, especially the grandfather clock. Jack didn't miss that detail. Finally, Clayton stopped. I'll get straight to the point. Please do. I hear you've discovered something interesting. Jack's expression remained neutral. Years of military service had taught him how to hide reactions. What kind of something? Clayton smiled again. The same cold smile. The kind involving land. Silence settled between them. Jack understood immediately. News had escaped. Somehow, somewhere, someone knew. Clayton spread his hands. I'm a practical man. And? I'd like to make you an offer. Jack didn't answer. The developer continued. I know what Walter Finch left behind. The statement landed like a hammer. Shadow immediately stepped closer. The dog's ears rose. His posture stiffened. Jack remained calm. Do you? Clayton nodded. The mineral rights alone are worth a fortune. Jack said nothing. The developer's eyes drifted across the shop. You could walk away tomorrow. Walk away from what? Responsibility. The words sounded strange coming from him, almost rehearsed. You've spent years struggling, sleeping in a truck, trying to survive. Clayton smiled. I can solve that problem. Jack already knew where the conversation was headed. How much? The developer named a number. A very large number. More money than Jack had ever possessed. Enough to buy a house. Enough to retire. Enough to disappear forever. The offer hung in the air. Clayton clearly expected interest. Perhaps gratitude. Instead, Jack looked toward the grandfather clock, then at Shadow, then back at the developer. No, the smile vanished, only for a second, then returned. Perhaps you should think about it. I already did. Clayton's eyes hardened. The friendliness disappeared. Not completely. Just enough. The mask slipping. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Jack met his gaze. Funny. Clayton frowned. What is? People keep saying that to me. The developer turned toward the door. But before leaving, he paused. The valley is changing, Mr. Mercer. His voice had grown colder. People who resist change usually regret it. Then he left. The SUV disappeared down Main Street. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Shadow remained beside the window, watching. Jack stood motionless. Something had shifted. The mystery was no longer hidden. Other people wanted what Walter Finch had left behind. Powerful people. Determined people. The kind of people who viewed history as an obstacle, not a responsibility. That night, long after the town fell asleep, Jack sat alone beside the wood stove. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Shadow rested nearby. The old shepherd suddenly lifted his head. A low growl emerged from his throat. Jack immediately looked up. The dog never growled without reason. Outside the front window, a shadow moved, then another. Someone was standing near the shop, watching. The figure disappeared before Jack reached the door. But the message remained. Clear, unmistakable. The fight Walter Finch had tried to prevent had finally arrived. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the falling snow, men had already begun deciding how far they were willing to go to take what they wanted. Jack stood at the front window long after the shadow disappeared. The street beyond the glass looked empty. Snow drifted lazily beneath the yellow glow of the streetlights. Nothing moved, nothing seemed out of place. Yet every instinct he had developed during 27 years as a Navy SEAL told him otherwise. Someone had been there, watching, studying, waiting. Shadow remained beside the door. The German shepherd's posture was rigid, focused, alert. The same posture Jack had seen countless times before dangerous situations. The dog trusted his senses, and Jack trusted the dog. By morning, Silver Creek appeared peaceful again. Children walked to school. Trucks rolled through town. Steam rose from chimneys. Life continued as if nothing had happened. But Jack noticed the black SUV parked across the street shortly after breakfast. Then again near noon. Then once more after sunset. Clayton Rhodes wasn't hiding his interest anymore. That alone worried Jack. People who planned to play fair rarely needed intimidation. 3 days later, a county attorney arrived. A polite man named Robert Ellis, gray suit, briefcase, careful smile. He introduced himself and explained that he represented several investors interested in the Finch properties. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. The offer was larger than the first one. Much larger. Jack declined. Again. Robert Ellis left politely, but disappointment showed in his eyes. The pressure was increasing, and everyone knew it. That evening, Maggie Turner stopped by with coffee and sandwiches. She set the bag on the counter and looked around nervously. People are talking. Jack frowned. About what? The land, he sighed. Of course. Small towns had always operated faster than newspapers. Rumors traveled at the speed of curiosity. Maggie lowered her voice. Some folks think you're sitting on a fortune. I'm sitting on a repair shop. You know what I mean. Jack did, unfortunately. She glanced toward the window. I don't trust Clayton Rhodes. Neither do I. Maggie nodded. Good. Then she looked toward Shadow. The dog sat beside the grandfather clock, watching, always watching. I trust him, though. Jack smiled. Smart woman. The following week brought more visitors, not customers, observers. People who wandered into the shop pretending curiosity. People who asked strange questions. People interested in documents rather than clocks. Jack answered very little. The less information available, the safer Walter's legacy remained. Meanwhile, Shadow became increasingly protective. The old shepherd followed Jack constantly. At night, he patrolled the building. Twice, he woke Jack after hearing movement outside. Each time, the intruder vanished before they could be identified. But the message remained. Someone was testing boundaries. One Friday evening, a meeting was held at the town hall. Local business owners gathered to discuss development proposals throughout the valley. Jack attended only because Evelyn asked him to. Clayton Rhodes attended too. The developer spoke confidently, professionally, charmingly. He described investment opportunities, jobs, growth, progress. Most people listened politely. Then he mentioned the Finch properties, not by name, but indirectly, suggesting that unused land should be developed for the benefit of everyone. Jack understood the target immediately. So did Evelyn. So did Maggie. The room grew noticeably quieter. After the meeting ended, Clayton approached him. The smile returned, the same polished smile, the same cold eyes. "You still have time to reconsider." Jack looked at him calmly. "I already have." Clayton's expression hardened. "Only slightly. Stubbornness can become expensive." Jack stepped closer. Years of military leadership had taught him how to remain calm under pressure. "Then I guess we'll both spend some money." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Clayton walked away. The threat lingered long after he left. 2 nights later, trouble arrived. The storm began shortly after midnight. Strong winds rattled the shop windows. Snow hammered the glass. Jack slept lightly. Shadow slept near the front entrance. At least he appeared to be sleeping. Suddenly the dog exploded into motion. A bark shattered the silence. Then another. Then another. Jack sat upright immediately. Years of training took over. He grabbed a flashlight. The old shepherd raced toward the rear of the building, not the front. The rear. Jack followed. The back door stood partially open. A freezing gust of wind poured inside. Someone had forced it. Fresh footprints crossed the snow outside. Jack's pulse accelerated. "Shadow!" The dog vanished into the darkness. A second later came another bark, then a crash, then silence. Jack ran. The flashlight beam bounced wildly across the storm. Snow stung his face. The footprints led toward a narrow alley behind the neighboring buildings. Shadow's barking resumed. Fierce, relentless, protective. Then came a sharp yelp. A sound Jack had heard only a handful of times in the dog's entire life. Fear struck instantly. Pure, primal. "Shadow!" He sprinted toward the sound. The flashlight beam found movement. A figure running away through the storm, disappearing between buildings. Jack started after him, then heard another whimper. Everything else stopped mattering. He turned. Shadow lay near a stack of wooden pallets. The shepherd struggled to stand. One front leg hung awkwardly, injured. The old dog's breathing came fast. Pain flashed in his eyes. Jack dropped to his knees immediately. His heart felt as though someone had wrapped a fist around it. No, buddy." Shadow tried to rise, still trying to work, still trying to protect. Even now, Jack gently placed both hands against the dog's shoulders. "It's okay." The shepherd looked at him, trusting him completely. The realization nearly broke him. The intruder was gone. The fight was over, but Shadow had paid the price. Within minutes, several townspeople arrived after hearing the commotion. Maggie, Evelyn, even Ben Holloway. Someone called the local veterinarian. The clinic opened despite the late hour. Jack rode in the back seat, with Shadow the entire way. One hand never left the dog's side. Snow blurred past the windows. The veterinarian examined him carefully. The wait felt endless. Finally, the doctor returned. Good news, no permanent damage. A deep cut, severe bruising. A strained shoulder, painful, but recoverable. Jack released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed through him so powerfully his knees nearly gave out. Shadow would heal. The dog would heal. That was all that mattered. As dawn approached, Jack sat beside the recovery kennel. The clinic was quiet. The storm had finally ended. Shadow slept peacefully beneath a blanket. For the first time in years, Jack felt tears forming, not because of fear, because of guilt. The old shepherd had followed him through deserts, mountains, cities, wars. Now, after surviving all of that, He had been injured protecting a clock shop, protecting Walter Finch's legacy, protecting him. Jack lowered his head. I should have stopped this. A familiar voice answered from behind him. No, it was Evelyn. She had remained at the clinic all night. The librarian sat beside him. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, she nodded toward Shadow. He made his choice. Jack looked through the kennel door. The old shepherd slept peacefully. Even injured, he looked ready to get back up and continue guarding the shop. The sight filled Jack with equal parts pride and heartbreak. Evelyn smiled softly. That dog loves you. Jack stared at Shadow. The truth was obvious. Always had been. Then Evelyn added something else. Which means whatever comes next, you're not fighting alone. Outside, the first light of morning spread across the mountains. Inside the clinic, Jack reached through the kennel door and rested a hand against Shadow's fur. The old dog stirred slightly, then settled again, safe, alive, recovering. And in that quiet moment, Jack made a decision. Clayton Rhodes wanted Walter Finch's legacy. Others wanted it too. That much was now undeniable. But if they thought an aging veteran and an old military dog would simply surrender it, they had badly misunderstood both of them. Because Shadow had already made his choice, and now Jack was ready to make his. The sun rose slowly over Silver Creek. Fresh snow sparkled across rooftops and fences. The mountains glowed pink beneath the early light. From the outside, the town looked peaceful. But beneath that calm surface, something had changed. Word of the break-in spread quickly. By breakfast, nearly everyone in town had heard that someone had targeted the old clockmaker's shop. By lunch, everyone had heard that Shadow had been injured protecting it. And by dinner, people were choosing sides. Jack sat beside Shadow's recovery kennel at the veterinary clinic. The German shepherd was awake now. His injured leg remained bandaged. The veterinarian had ordered several weeks of rest. Shadow clearly disagreed. The dog attempted to stand every few minutes. Each time, Jack gently persuaded him to lie back down. You've done enough. Shadow looked unconvinced. The old soldier smiled. Some things never changed. Late that morning, Maggie Turner arrived carrying coffee. Evelyn Hart arrived with a stack of documents. Ben Holloway followed shortly afterward. Then came 3 local veterans, then 2 ranchers, then a retired school principal. By noon, the clinic waiting room looked less like a veterinary office and more like a community meeting. Jack stared at them in surprise. What is all this? Maggie crossed her arms. Support. Ben nodded. About time somebody stood up to Rhodes. The room filled with agreement. For the first time, Jack began to understand something important. This fight was no longer just his. Clayton Rhodes had spent years making promises, development, expansion, growth. Some people believed him, others did not. Many had watched old buildings disappear, historic land sold, community decisions made by people who didn't actually live there. Walter Finch's legacy had become a symbol of something larger, the future of Silver Creek itself. That afternoon, Evelyn spread dozens of documents across a long table inside the library. The old building became headquarters. Maps covered one wall. Historical records covered another. Everyone searched, compared notes, asked questions. The more they investigated, the stranger Clayton Rhodes appeared. Several land purchases seemed unusually complicated. Property transfers passed through multiple companies. Ownership records shifted repeatedly. Nothing illegal was obvious, but something felt wrong. Jack recognized the feeling immediately. Years of military operations had taught him to trust patterns, and these patterns didn't make sense. 3 days later, the breakthrough arrived. Not from Jack, not from Evelyn, from a retired county surveyor named Harold Jensen. The 80-year-old arrived carrying a battered cardboard box. I think you need to see these. Inside sat decades-old land surveys, property maps, tax records, forgotten county documents. Harold placed one map on the table, then another, then another. The room gradually fell silent. Evelyn adjusted her glasses. Jack leaned forward. Maggie stopped pouring coffee. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Several valuable properties currently controlled by companies connected to Clayton Roads had once belonged to local families. Families who believed they had sold only limited rights, not complete ownership. Somehow, over the years, the agreements had changed. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough. Enough to transfer valuable control away from local residents. Ben Holloway stared at the maps. "You're telling me people lost land without realizing it?" Harold nodded slowly. "Looks that way." The room grew quiet, very quiet. Jack studied the documents, then remembered something. Walter Finch's vault, the ledgers, the records, the files. A possibility formed immediately. What if Walter knew? Every head turned, Jack continued. He kept records of everything. Evelyn's eyes widened. The vault. Within an hour, they were back beneath the abandoned railroad station. Jack unlocked the vault. The heavy door swung open. Rows of documents waited in silence. Decades of history, decades of records, decades of truth. This time they searched with purpose. Folder after folder, box after box. Then Maggie found it. A ledger, small, black, unremarkable, until they opened it. Walter Finch had been documenting land transactions throughout the valley for nearly 40 years. Not because he expected trouble, because he believed history should be preserved. Every agreement, every transfer, every survey, everything. The deeper they read, the clearer the picture became. Walter had quietly recorded discrepancies, questionable transactions, conflicting ownership claims. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just facts. Carefully documented facts. The kind that could survive courtrooms. The kind that could survive lawyers. The kind that could survive time. Jack felt a chill. Walter Finch hadn't merely preserved a legacy. He had preserved evidence. Evidence no one realized existed. And evidence Clayton Roads would desperately want hidden. The next week transformed Silver Creek. Lawyers reviewed the documents. County officials became involved. Investigators requested copies. News traveled beyond town limits. For the first time, Clayton Roads stopped appearing on Main Street. The black SUV disappeared. The polite offers ended. The pressure vanished. And somehow that was even more telling. Then came the town meeting. The largest gathering Silver Creek had seen in years. The community center overflowed. Ranchers, teachers, shop owners, veterans, families, people who rarely attended anything. Everyone came. Jack sat quietly near the back. Shadow lay beside him, finally allowed to leave the clinic. The shepherd still limped slightly, but his eyes remained bright. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. Lawyers explained findings. Officials discussed records. Residents shared concerns. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, people stood and spoke about the Clockmaker's shop, what it meant, why it mattered. An elderly woman described Walter repairing her parents' wedding clock. A teacher spoke about local history. A veteran described finding purpose again while helping Jack restore the building. The stories continued, and continued, and continued. Jack listened in stunned silence, because none of them were really talking about clocks. They were talking about belonging, about memory, about home. By the end of the evening, the room had made its decision. Not formally, not legally, something stronger. Emotionally, the town had chosen. Walter Finch's legacy would remain in Silver Creek. The Clockmaker's shop would survive. The room erupted into applause. Not for Jack, not for politics, for the future, for the community, for themselves. Jack looked down at Shadow. The old dog rested peacefully against his boot. Weeks earlier, he had arrived in town homeless, alone, broken. Now an entire community stood beside him. The realization felt overwhelming. Outside, snow began falling once more. Soft, gentle, beautiful. As people slowly left the building, Maggie approached. "You know what's funny?" Jack smiled. "What?" "You came here looking for shelter." He glanced around the crowded room. The laughter, the conversations, the familiar faces, then down at Shadow, the dog who had refused to leave a silent clock, the dog who had changed everything. Maggie smiled. "Looks like you found a home instead." For the first time in many years, Jack Mercer realized she was right. And somewhere beyond the falling snow, beneath the quiet Montana mountains, It felt as though Walter Finch already knew exactly how this story would end. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Silver Creek. The deep snowpacks along the mountains began shrinking beneath warmer sunlight. Icicles disappeared from rooftops. Streams awakened beneath the ice. The valley changed one day at a time, so did Jack. Months passed. The clockmaker's shop became the busiest building on Main Street. Not because people suddenly cared about clocks, because they cared about what the shop had become. The restoration happened gradually. Volunteers painted walls. Carpenters repaired damaged woodwork. Electricians updated aging wiring. Students from the local high school helped clean and organize decades of historical records. Retired craftsmen donated tools. Veterans donated time. Everyone seemed eager to contribute. The building no longer belonged only to Walter Finch or to Jack. It belonged to Silver Creek, and that made all the difference. The old sign above the door was carefully restored. Finch Clocks. The original lettering gleamed once again. Inside, dozens of repaired clocks now filled the room with life. Ticking, clicking, measuring. The silence that had once dominated the shop had disappeared. In its place came something warmer, something hopeful. The sound of time moving forward. Jack stood near the front counter one bright spring morning and watched sunlight spill through the windows. Customers chatted quietly. Coffee brewed near the back. A young veteran from Missoula sat at a workbench learning how to repair a mantel clock. Across the room, two local teenagers organized historical records. Near the stove, several older residents exchanged stories about the town's past. The shop had become more than a repair business. It had become a gathering place, a refuge, a home. Exactly the kind of place Walter Finch would have loved. Most remarkable of all was what happened every Thursday. Veterans from across the valley began gathering inside the shop. Some came for coffee, some came for conversation. Some simply came to sit quietly among people who understood. No formal program existed, no speeches, no ceremonies, just companionship, purpose, community, the things many of them had been missing. Jack never planned any of it. The idea had simply grown, like everything worthwhile seemed to. And through it all, Shadow remained the center of attention. The old German shepherd had become something of a local celebrity. Children stopped by just to see him. Tourists asked to take photographs. Veterans greeted him like an old friend. The newspaper even published a story about the retired military dog who uncovered Silver Creek's greatest mystery. Shadow accepted the attention with calm dignity. Although age was beginning to show, the injury had healed, but his movements were slower now. His muzzle had turned almost completely silver. Sometimes he slept longer than before. Sometimes he watched the room instead of exploring it. Jack noticed every change and treasured every day. One afternoon, Evelyn Hart arrived carrying a small wooden box. The librarian looked unusually excited. "I found something," Jack smiled. That phrase usually means trouble. Not this time. She placed the box on the workbench. Inside rested a single journal page, folded carefully. Preserved between protective sheets, Jack frowned. "I thought we found all of Walter's journals." "So did I." He unfolded the page. The handwriting was unmistakable. Walter Finch. The date near the top surprised him. August 2, 1964. Just weeks before the clockmaker vanished from public life. The room gradually quieted as Jack began reading. Several veterans looked over. Maggie paused near the coffee station. Even Shadow lifted his head. The page contained only a few paragraphs, but they stopped everyone cold. If this page is ever discovered, then the future has unfolded exactly as I hoped. The clock has survived. The shop has survived. Most importantly, the people have survived. Jack continued reading. "I do not know who will stand in this room when these words are read. Perhaps a member of the Mercer family. Perhaps a stranger. Perhaps someone I could never imagine. But I know this. If you are here, then the shop still matters. And if the shop still matters, then Silver Creek still remembers who it is." The room remained silent. Jack's voice grew softer. Then came the final section, the words that would stay with him forever. "There is one last test. Not for the clock, not for the building, for the person who finds this page. Ask yourself one question. Did a loyal dog lead a weary soldier to this clock? If the answer is yes, then I know I chose the right hiding place. Jack stopped reading. No one spoke. No one moved. Across the room, every eye slowly turned toward Shadow. The old German shepherd lay beneath the grandfather clock, the exact place where he had first stopped months earlier, the exact place where everything had begun. For several moments, nobody said a word. Then Maggie laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because the moment felt impossible, beautiful, perfect. Evelyn wiped away a tear. Even Ben Holloway shook his head in disbelief. Walter Finch had never met Jack, never met Shadow, yet somehow he had imagined them, or someone very much like them. The mystery that began with a silent clock had finally reached its final page. That evening the town gathered for a celebration. String lights illuminated Main Street. Children played beneath banners. Music drifted through the warm spring air. The restored Clockmaker's shop stood at the center of it all. Its windows glowed golden against the darkening mountains. Inside, the great-grandfather clock finally worked again. After months of restoration, careful repairs, and patient effort, its pendulum now swung steadily behind the glass. Tick, 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 the sound filled the room, steady, strong, alive. Late in the evening, a young boy approached Jack. The child couldn't have been older than 10. He looked up at the former seal. "Mr. Mercer?" Jack smiled. "Yes?" The boy pointed toward the grandfather clock. "My grandpa says you found treasure in there." A few people nearby laughed softly. Jack looked toward the clock, then toward Shadow. The old dog slept peacefully beneath it, content, safe, home. Jack's smile widened. "I didn't find it." The boy looked confused. "Then who did?" Jack pointed toward Shadow. The room followed his gesture. The sleeping German shepherd opened one eye briefly, then closed it again. The crowd laughed, warmly, gently, truthfully. Because everyone knew the answer. The greatest treasure had never been hidden in the vault, never hidden in the land, never hidden in the documents. It was hidden in the journey itself. A homeless veteran finding purpose, a forgotten town finding community, a legacy finding its guardian, and a loyal dog refusing to leave. As night settled over Silver Creek, the grandfather clock continued ticking. The sound drifted through the restored shop, through the open doorway, into the town beyond. Jack stood quietly beside Shadow. One hand rested on the old dog's shoulder. The mountains stood dark against the stars. The valley slept peacefully. And for the first time since leaving the Navy, Jack Mercer felt completely at peace. Not because every problem had disappeared, not because life had become easy, because he finally understood something Walter Finch had known all along. Home is not the place where your story begins. Home is the place where your story finally makes sense. The grandfather clock ticked steadily. Shadow slept beneath it, and time at last moved forward. If you believe loyalty, courage, and doing the right thing still matter, comment 1 below. And comment 0 if you think too many people have forgotten those values. Sometimes the greatest treasure isn't money or land, but finding a purpose worth standing for. And if stories about justice, dignity, and perseverance speak to you, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next journey.